My name is Nora Callahan. I'm 20, and 3 days before my mother gave me an ultimatum, I'd caught a data mapping error in a hospital scheduling system that would have double booked 41 surgical patients across two campuses in a single week. Nobody at my family's table that Sunday cared about that number. They cared about a different one. The $14 an hour PulsePoint Health was paying me as a junior developer, part-time, remote, fit around my class schedule at State, and the fact that in my mother's eyes, that number made me a disappointment she could no longer politely ignore. $14 an hour, she repeated, setting her fork down with the specific, deliberate click she uses when she wants a sound to land like punctuation. Nora, you are a computer science major at a good school, and you're telling me you're spending your semester writing code for $14 an hour instead of applying to real internships. Internships that actually go on a resume. Internships your cousin Danielle would have killed for. We were at my aunt's house that night, not our own, which made it worse. 12 people around a table set for my cousin Danielle's acceptance into her third year of med school, a dinner my mother had spent 2 weeks talking about, like it was a coronation. I'd been invited the same way you invite the caterer's extra chair, present but not really expected to contribute anything the room would remember. "It's a real job, Mom," I said, keeping my voice low, aware of every set of eyes at that table, even though most of them were still politely pretending to focus on their plates. "It's a legitimate healthcare tech startup. I'm building patient scheduling infrastructure. It's not some gig app thing. It's $14 an hour," she said again, like repetition itself was an argument. "You could be shadowing at the hospital with Danielle. You could be doing something that actually builds a career, instead of typing at a laptop in your dorm room for pocket change." My jaw tightened. A small, precise pressure I felt travel down into my shoulders. I want you to understand something about my mother before I go further. She wasn't a cruel woman in the dramatic, cartoonish sense. She genuinely believed, with total sincerity, that value could only be measured in the specific shapes she recognized: a stethoscope, a white coat, a law degree, the kind of job you could describe in 6 words at a dinner party and watch people nod immediately. Anything outside that shape didn't register to her as real, no matter how much math I tried to do to prove otherwise. My aunt, sensing the temperature of the table shifting, tried to redirect. "Danielle, tell everyone about your rotation schedule," she said, a little too brightly, and the table pivoted gratefully, the way tables do when they're relieved to have an easier subject handed to them. I sat there with my water glass sweating in my hand and did the math anyway, silently, the way I'd been doing it my whole life, without ever calling it math. Danielle's acceptance letter got printed out and framed in my aunt's hallway. My acceptance letter to State's computer science program 3 years earlier got a "That's great, honey," and a return to whatever my mother had actually been doing that afternoon. If you've ever sat at a family dinner and watched your own accomplishment get quietly filed under a lesser category than your cousin's, not because it mattered less, but because it didn't look the way your family had decided success was supposed to look. I want you to know exactly how loud that silence gets, even while everyone around you keeps talking. Drop a comment if you've had a version of that dinner. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why silence isn't the same thing as agreement. The real conversation, the one that actually mattered, happened after we got home. My mother waited until we were in the kitchen. My father already retreated to the living room with the specific, practiced invisibility he deployed whenever my mother's voice got that particular edge to it, the one that meant a decision had already been made, and the conversation happening now was just a formality. "I want you to quit that job," she said without preamble, setting her purse down on the counter with more force than the purse deserved. "Mom, I'm not quitting my job. It's a real position. I'm learning things I couldn't learn in a classroom." "You're learning to disappoint me," she said, and I felt that land somewhere just under my ribs, precise and practiced, the way she always seemed to know exactly where to aim. Danielle is going to be a doctor. Your cousin Marcus is finishing his law degree next spring, and you're telling me you want to spend your college years typing code for a company nobody in this family has even heard of for less money than you'd make waitressing. It's not about the money right now, I said. It's about experience. It's about building something real. It's about you embarrassing this family, she said, and her voice had gone quiet now, which was somehow worse than loud. Every time someone asks me what my daughter does, I have to explain a job title nobody understands, for a company nobody's heard of, making less than minimum wage would pay in some states. I am tired of explaining you, Nora. I stood very still in that kitchen, the same kitchen I'd done my homework in since I was 6 years old, and felt something in my chest go cold and quiet in a way it never had before during one of these conversations. Usually, I argued back. Usually, I tried to make her understand, laid out the actual mechanics of what I was building, tried to translate my world into terms she'd recognize as legitimate. That night, for the first time, I didn't try. I'm not quitting, I said instead. Simple, flat, final. My mother looked at me for a long moment, something calculating happening behind her eyes. The specific look she got when a negotiation wasn't going the way she'd planned it, and she was deciding how much further she was willing to escalate to win it. Then quit by Sunday, she said, or find somewhere else to sleep. If you've ever had someone you love turn your own home into leverage over something they simply didn't understand, you already know the specific, cold shock of that moment, the second your safety and your identity get put on opposite sides of a scale. Drop a comment if that's ever happened to you. I want to hear it. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my childhood bedroom, staring at the same water stain on the ceiling I'd been staring at since middle school, and did the actual arithmetic, not the metaphorical kind, the literal kind. Numbers on a legal pad by the light of my phone, because some part of me needed to see it in ink to believe it was real. Rent for a shared room near campus, roughly $600 a month if I could find something fast. My Pulse Point paycheck, at $14 an hour for roughly 20 hours a week, came to just over $1,100 a month before taxes. My meal plan was already paid through the semester. My laptop was mine, bought with savings from 2 years of babysitting before I'd ever touched a line of code. It wasn't comfortable math. It wasn't math that left room for anything going wrong. But it was math that worked. Technically, if I was careful, if I was lucky, if nothing broke. I thought about calling my mother's bluff simply by staying, waiting to see if Sunday actually arrived with consequences or dissolved the way some threats do once the person making them has slept on it. I thought about that for almost an hour, lying in the dark, before I understood something important about my mother that I'd apparently always known and never let myself fully admit. She didn't make idle threats. She made decisions and then dared the world to talk her out of them. And in 20 years, nobody in our family had ever successfully done that, including my father, including me, including everyone at that dinner table who'd watched her steer an entire evening toward her own daughter's humiliation without so much as a raised eyebrow from anyone brave enough to redirect it back. I opened my laptop instead at 2 a.m. and pulled up the internal dashboard for PulsePoint's scheduling platform, the same system I'd been quietly patching bugs in for 6 weeks, the same error I'd caught 3 days earlier that would have double-booked 41 surgical patients if it had gone live unnoticed. I sat there in the dark, the blue light of the screen the only light in the room, and read back through my own commit history, the way you might read back through old journal entries, looking for proof that the last 6 weeks had actually been real, had actually meant something, even if nobody at that dinner table had bothered to ask. 41 patients, one scheduling conflict, caught before it happened, buried in a system most people in my family would never understand and had already decided, without looking, wasn't worth understanding. I didn't know yet exactly what I was going to do. I only knew, closing the laptop somewhere close to 3 in the morning, that I wasn't going to quit. Not because I was trying to prove anything to my mother. Not yet, not that night. Just because some quiet, stubborn part of me had finally stopped waiting for her permission to believe my own work mattered. Sunday arrived exactly the way my mother had promised it would. I came home from a Saturday shift at the campus library, my second job, the one that actually did meet my mother's approval because it had assistant in the title and happened inside a building she recognized, and found 2 garbage bags sitting just inside the front door, packed with clothes I recognized as mine. My mother was in the kitchen, back straight, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a woman who had rehearsed this moment enough times that it no longer cost her anything to deliver it. "Did you quit?" she asked, though I could tell from her face she already knew the answer. "No," I said. She nodded once, like I'd confirmed something she'd already written down. "Then you know where the door is." I stood in that kitchen for a long moment, looking at my mother, looking at the 2 garbage bags by the door, looking at my father hovering uselessly in the hallway behind her, not meeting my eyes. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in how cold it was, exactly what I'd become to this family somewhere over the last 20 years without anyone ever announcing it out loud. Not a daughter they were proud of, not even in that moment, a daughter at all. Just a line item that had finally stopped balancing the way they needed it to. I carried both garbage bags to my car myself. Nobody offered to help, which somehow hurt less than I expected. By that point, I think some part of me had already stopped waiting for help to arrive from that particular direction. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time before I turned the key, the 2 bags stuffed into my back seat, smelling faintly of the fabric softener my mother always used, a smell I'd known my entire life and would now, apparently, have to relearn how to live without missing. My hands weren't shaking. I noticed that specifically sitting there because I'd expected them to be. What I felt instead was a strange, hollow stillness, the particular quiet that comes right after a decision has been made for you, and there's nothing left to do but figure out the next concrete step. I texted my roommate from freshman year, Priya, who'd since moved into a 2-bedroom off-campus with a girl who dropped out mid-semester, leaving a spare room and a lease. Priya had been quietly panicking about covering alone. "Hey, weird question. Is that second room still open?" Long story. She called me back within 90 seconds. I told her the short version, sitting in my car outside my parents' house with the porch light still burning behind me, and she said, without hesitation, "Come now. We'll figure out money later. You can have the room." That was the first thing that happened in those 7 weeks that felt like an actual answer instead of just another problem. A friend who didn't need the whole story to say yes. The room Priya offered me was small, barely big enough for a twin mattress and a desk, with a window that looked out over the parking lot of the apartment complex and a radiator that clanked audibly every time it kicked on. A sound I got used to fast because I spent most nights that first week awake anyway, staring at the same water-stained ceiling I'd left behind, except this one had a different pattern of cracks to memorize. I want to describe those first few nights honestly, because I think people romanticize this part of the story before they've actually lived it. It wasn't cinematic. It smelled like the particle board desk Priya's roommate had left behind, slightly warped from a leak nobody had ever fixed. It smelled like the instant ramen I ate more of that month than I had in the previous 2 years combined, the specific dry, salty smell of the seasoning packet before you add the water. Because sometimes I microwaved it dry just to have something to chew on between classes. My meal plan covered breakfast and dinner on campus, which meant most days I lived on whatever I could carry back from the dining hall in a plastic container, cold pasta eaten at my desk at 11 at night while I debugged code for a company that had no idea my living situation had just detonated over its existence. I didn't tell my manager at Pulse Point what had happened. I want to be honest about that because it matters for what comes later. I didn't go looking for sympathy from my job, didn't lean on the story of my family for softness or slack. I just kept showing up, logging my hours, submitting my pull requests on schedule, because work, it turned out, was the one part of my life that hadn't changed shape overnight. The scheduling system didn't care whether I had a bed at my parents' house, it only cared whether the code compiled. If you've ever had to keep performing competence in one part of your life while everything underneath it was quietly falling apart, you already know exactly the specific exhaustion I'm describing. Drop a comment if you've lived through your own version of that split. I promise there's a reason I'm walking you through all of it. Here's the arithmetic of those 7 weeks, the actual math, because I think it matters more than any single dramatic moment. I was pulling roughly 20 hours a week at Pulse Point, another 12 at the library, carrying 5 classes, and sleeping, on a good week, maybe 5 hours a night. My hands developed a specific, permanent restlessness from too much caffeine and not enough food at regular times. I lost 8 pounds in the first month without trying to, the particular weight loss that comes from stress and skipped meals rather than any deliberate choice. And I remember standing in Priya's tiny bathroom one morning, looking at my own face in the mirror, and thinking, with the strange detachment of someone watching their own life from slightly outside it, that I looked like someone in the middle of building something, even if I couldn't yet say exactly what. I didn't call my mother. She didn't call me. 7 days went by, then 14, then 3 weeks, and the silence between us took on its own specific weight. Heavier every week, it went unbroken. The way debt accrues interest quietly in the background, whether or not you're looking at the account. My father texted once, in the second week. A single line, "Hope you're doing okay, kiddo," sent, I noticed from the timestamp, at 11:47 p.m., likely after my mother was already asleep. I stared at that message for a long time before I answered it. I'm okay. Staying with Priya. He didn't write back after that, and I understood. Reading his silence the way I'd learned to read silences in that family, that he'd used up whatever small courage he had for the month just sending those 11 words in the first place. The work itself, meanwhile, kept accelerating in a direction I hadn't fully anticipated. 3 weeks into living at Priya's, my manager at Pulse Point, a sharp, exacting woman named Renata, who ran engineering with the specific intensity of someone who'd built 2 startups before this one and had no patience left for anything performative, pulled me into a call I assumed, at first, was going to be about a minor bug I'd flagged the week before. It wasn't. "The double booking catch you found last month," she said, her voice all business. The particular tone she used when something mattered enough that she wasn't going to waste time on pleasantries. I had our compliance team run a full audit after that. Turns out it wasn't isolated. There's a systemic flaw in how the scheduling engine handles cross-campus resource allocation. It's been silently creating conflict risk for months across 4 hospital networks, and nobody caught it until you did. I sat very still at my desk, the specific stillness that comes right before you understand you're about to be handed something bigger than you were braced for. "How systemic?" I asked. "Systemic enough that if it goes live at scale without a fix, we're looking at real patient safety exposure and real liability exposure for every hospital system running our platform." She paused, and I heard something shift in her voice, warmer now, more direct. "I want you leading the patch, not just contributing to it, leading it. You clearly understand this part of the architecture better than anyone else on the team right now, including people who've been here 3 years longer than you." I didn't say anything for a second because I was busy making sure my voice would hold steady before I used it. "I'm still technically part-time," I said. "I'm not sure I'm supposed to be leading anything." "You're the person who caught what 4 senior engineers missed," Renata said, flat, matter-of-fact, the way you state something that isn't up for debate. "Title's not the point right now. Competence is. We'll figure out the title later. For now, I need you on this. Full focus, starting tomorrow." I hung up the call and sat in that small, cracked room with the clanking radiator and let myself feel, for the first time in 3 weeks, something other than exhaustion. It wasn't triumph, exactly. It was quieter than that. The specific, private satisfaction of being handed proof, real and undeniable, that the thing my mother had called pocket change was about to become the center of a hospital network's entire patient safety infrastructure. I started keeping records after that call, not because I had a plan yet. I want to be honest about that, the same way I was honest about this with myself at the time. I wasn't building a case to detonate at some future family dinner. I was just, for the first time in my life, keeping an accurate account of my own work, because I'd finally understood that if I didn't do it, nobody else in my family ever would. I saved Renata's email confirming the lead role. I saved the internal Slack thread where 2 senior engineers, both of whom had been at PulsePoint for years, publicly acknowledged that my fix had likely prevented a scheduling failure serious enough to trigger a state health department review. I saved the compliance report, 40 pages of dense technical language about cross-campus resource conflicts and liability exposure, with my name listed as lead remediation engineer on the cover page, a title that hadn't existed for me 3 weeks earlier and now sat there in black and white like it had always belonged to me. I put all of it in a folder on my laptop, named simply Work. Unglamorous and quiet, sitting between my class notes and old problem sets like it was nothing special. Most days, it felt like nothing special, just the accumulating evidence of a job I was good at, the same way anyone accumulates the paper trail of a career they're building. Some nights, though, lying awake in that small room, listening to the radiator clank and Priya's television murmuring faintly through the wall, I let myself open the folder just to look at it. Not for validation, not yet, not really. Just to remind myself, in the specific stillness of 2 a.m, when doubt tends to get loudest, that the math I was doing on my own was real. Whether or not anyone in my family had bothered to check it yet. Every family has a version of the math they use to decide who's worth investing in, and sometimes the only way to see it clearly is from outside the house they built it in. If you've ever had to leave in order to finally see your own worth accurately, keep watching. The arithmetic in this story isn't finished yet. 5 weeks in, Renata called another meeting, this time with the company's chief medical officer sitting in, a soft-spoken man named Dr. Okafor, who reviewed my remediation plan line by line, asked sharp, specific questions about failover logic and audit trails, and at the end of the call said simply, "This is some of the cleanest patient safety engineering I've reviewed from anyone at this company, junior or senior. I want this documented as a case study for our next board presentation." A board presentation. My name, my code, my fix, sitting in front of the people who'd decided, 6 weeks earlier, that $14 an hour was a fair starting wage for someone they hadn't yet realized they needed. I didn't tell my mother any of this. I want to be clear about that, because it would have been easy, in a weaker moment, to pick up the phone and lead with it. "Did you know, Mom? Did you know what I've actually been building this whole time?" The same old ache for her to finally notice, dressed up in a new, more impressive number. I didn't call. Some quiet, stubborn part of me understood, sitting in that small room with the radiator clanking and my folder of saved emails growing heavier every week, that I wasn't ready yet to hand her the satisfaction of being the one who told her. I wanted her to find out the way I had found out over the last 5 weeks exactly how much her arithmetic had gotten wrong. My mother finally called in the 6th week on a Tuesday evening while I was sitting cross-legged on my mattress with my laptop balanced on a stack of textbooks, reviewing failover logic for the 3rd hospital network we'd migrated onto the patched scheduling system that day. I almost let it go to voicemail. Some old, tired reflex in me still expected, even then, that picking up would mean absorbing whatever she needed to say and quietly rearranging myself around it, the way I always had. I answered anyway, mostly out of habit. "Hi, Mom." "Are you eating?" she asked. No greeting, straight into the question, her voice carrying an edge I couldn't immediately place. Not quite an apology, not quite the old certainty either. Something unsteady underneath it that I wasn't used to hearing from her. "I'm eating fine," I said, which was mostly true, if you didn't count the weeks of dry ramen and cold dining hall pasta that had become my actual diet. "Your aunt mentioned she saw you looked thin at Danielle's white coat ceremony." A pause. "You didn't tell me you went to that." I hadn't told her, because I hadn't told her much of anything in 6 weeks, and because the invitation, when it came from my aunt directly, had felt like the first thing in a long time that hadn't come with strings attached. I'd sat in the back of that auditorium, watching Danielle get draped in her short white coat, clapping along with 200 strangers, feeling a strange, complicated mixture of genuine happiness for my cousin and a small, persistent ache that nobody in that family had ever once clapped for anything I'd built. "I went because Danielle invited me," I said. "It was nice. She looked happy." "Nora." My mother's voice shifted, something almost pleading underneath the usual firmness. "How much longer is this going to go on? You staying with that roommate, barely talking to us? Your father misses you. She stopped herself, and I heard her exhale, long and controlled, the sound of a woman choosing her next words with unusual care. "I want you to come home. We can talk about the job. Maybe there's a compromise." 6 weeks earlier, that sentence would have undone me completely. I would have grabbed onto maybe there's a compromise like a life raft, packed my 2 garbage bags back into my car, and driven home within the hour. Grateful, relieved, ready to do whatever recalibrating was necessary to earn my way back into the house I'd grown up in. Instead, sitting on that thin mattress with failover logic still glowing on my laptop screen, I felt something colder and steadier settle into my chest. "What kind of compromise, Mom?" I asked. Because last time we talked about compromise, it meant I quit the job I'm good at and find something you can explain more easily at dinner parties. "That's not fair," she said. "Isn't it?" I kept my voice level, not raised, just precise, the same precision I used debugging code late at night, tracing a problem back to its actual source instead of the symptoms sitting on the surface. "You didn't ask me to compromise, Mom. You asked me to disappear into a version of myself you could be comfortable explaining. Those aren't the same thing." There was a long silence on the line. I let it sit there, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one who rushed in to fill it and smooth things over before she'd had to actually sit inside the discomfort she'd created. "I don't know how to talk about what you do," she said finally, quieter than I'd ever heard her. "I don't understand it. I look at Danielle in her white coat, and I understand exactly what that means, what it took, what it's going to become. I look at you typing on a laptop, and I don't have anything to hold on to. I don't know how to be proud of something I can't picture." It was, I realized, listening to her, probably the most honest thing my mother had ever said to me in 20 years. It didn't excuse anything. But it explained something I'd never quite let myself see clearly before, that her cruelty wasn't really about me at all. It was about her own limitations, dressed up as judgment aimed at the one child whose success didn't come in a shape she already had a frame ready for. "You could have asked me to explain it," I said, instead of deciding it didn't count. "I know," she said. "I know that now." If you've ever realized that the person judging you wasn't actually seeing you clearly, just measuring you against a picture they already had in their head, you know exactly the specific, strange grief of that realization. It doesn't make the hurt disappear. It just changes what you do with it. Drop a comment if you've had that exact moment. I didn't go home after that call. I want to explain why, because I think it's the actual center of this whole story, more than any single confrontation. For 6 weeks, some part of me had still been waiting, quietly, underneath all the exhaustion and the late nights and the dry ramen, for a moment exactly like that phone call. My mother softening, admitting fault, opening a door back to the life I'd grown up in. I had built an entire private hope around the idea that if I just held out long enough, eventually she'd see clearly enough to invite me back on terms that didn't require me to shrink. That call gave me exactly that opening. And sitting there afterward, staring at the ceiling crack that had become as familiar to me as my childhood water stain, I understood something that landed with the force of an actual physical shift in my chest. I didn't want to go back to what I'd had before. Not because I didn't love my mother. I did complicatedly, the way you love people who raised you, even when they've hurt you badly. I didn't want to go back because I'd finally understood what home had actually meant to her, functionally, for 20 years. It meant a place where I performed a role. Quiet, undemanding, available for babysitting my younger cousins, available for errands, available for whatever the family needed in exchange for a bed and a seat at the table that could be revoked the moment I stopped being useful in the specific ways she'd decided mattered. I wasn't a daughter in that equation. I was infrastructure, reliable, load-bearing, invisible until something needed fixing, and then suddenly very necessary, right up until the moment I asserted I wanted something for myself that didn't fit the blueprint. Infrastructure doesn't get invited to white coat ceremonies as the guest of honor. Infrastructure gets asked, quietly, to keep the house running while everyone else's achievements get framed and hung in the hallway. I texted her back that night after sitting with all of it for almost 2 hours. I love you, Mom. I'm not coming home right now. I need you to actually see what I've built before I can trust that door is really open. She didn't respond for 3 days. When she finally did, it was one line. Okay, I'm trying. It wasn't everything, but for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't waiting for it to be everything. I'd stopped calculating how much of myself I needed to shrink to earn her approval, and started calculating instead exactly how much proof it was going to take before she couldn't avoid seeing the truth anymore. The proof arrived faster than I expected. Renata called me into her office in person the following week. Not a video call this time, an actual in-person meeting, which at Pulse Point usually meant something significant enough that she didn't trust it to a screen. She had Dr. Okafor with her again, and a woman I didn't recognize, introduced simply as someone from the executive team. The board reviewed your remediation case study, Renata said, sliding a printed document across the desk toward me. They want to formalize your role. Full offer, not an internship extension, not part-time. Junior software engineer, full benefits, salary bump effective immediately, with a development track toward leading our patient safety engineering team once you graduate. I looked down at the offer letter, my name typed at the top in a font that suddenly felt very solid and very real. A salary figure printed beneath it that was, conservatively, 4 times what I'd been making 7 weeks earlier when my mother had called it pocket change. We don't usually do this for someone still finishing their degree, the executive said, watching my face carefully. But frankly, the work speaks for itself. You caught something 4 senior engineers missed, and then you led the fix better than most people twice your experience level would have. We'd be foolish not to formalize this now, before someone else does. I signed the offer letter with a hand that, for the first time in 7 weeks, wasn't tired or shaking or running on caffeine and adrenaline. It was steady, certain. The hand of someone who had finally stopped waiting for permission to know her own worth. I drove back to Priya's apartment that evening with the signed offer letter on the passenger seat beside me, and for the first time since the night I'd carried 2 garbage bags out to my car, I let myself cry. Not from grief this time, not from exhaustion. From something closer to relief, the specific, overwhelming relief of finally holding solid, undeniable proof of a truth I'd been quietly building toward for 7 weeks, entirely on my own, without anyone at that dinner table ever having to believe in me first. I thought about my mother's voice on the phone, small and uncertain in a way I'd never heard before. I don't know how to be proud of something I can't picture. I was about to make sure she didn't have to imagine it anymore.
I didn't tell my mother about the offer letter over the phone. I'd learned enough about her, over 20 years and especially over the last 7 weeks, to know that anything delivered secondhand, a phone call, a text, a story relayed through my father, would get filed away in her mind as an exaggeration, something to be politely doubted until proven otherwise. If I wanted her to actually see it, she needed to see it, not hear about it. So I called my aunt instead, the one who'd invited me to Danielle's white coat ceremony without asking anyone's permission first, and asked her a favor. "Sunday dinner," I said. "The next one. Is it still at your place?" "It is," she said, careful, clearly unsure where this was going. "Your mother's coming, your dad. Danielle's home that weekend too." "Can I come?" There was a pause on the line, warm and a little surprised. "Nora, honey, you never have to ask me that. Of course you can come." I spent the week before that dinner finishing the last piece of the patient safety rollout. The fourth and final hospital network migrated onto the patched scheduling system. 0 conflicts flagged across 11,000 scheduled procedures in the first testing window. Renata pulled the whole engineering team into a conference room on Thursday to walk through the results. And at the end of the meeting, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned that the board case study I'd built the remediation plan for was going to be presented at PulsePoint's Investor Update the following month, with my name on the byline. "You'll probably get asked to be in the room for that one," she said, sliding a folder across the table to me. "Executive team likes putting a face to good work when they can." I took the folder home that night and added it, quietly, to the growing stack of paper that had started as a private folder on my laptop and had since become something more solid, printed pages, an actual physical weight I could hold, the offer letter on top, the compliance report beneath it, the board case study now completing the set. I didn't build it to win an argument. By that point, 7 weeks in, I understood the difference clearly. I wasn't collecting proof to defeat my mother. I was simply finally holding an accurate record of who I actually was, in case anyone ever needed to see it plainly, instead of through the shape she'd always insisted on filtering me through. I packed the folder into my bag on Sunday morning, along with a change of clothes, and drove to my aunt's house for the second time. In 7 weeks this time, not as the extra chair nobody expected much from, but as someone who had, quietly and without permission, become somebody entirely her own. If you've ever walked back into a room that once made you feel small, carrying proof of exactly how wrong that room had been about you, you know there's a very specific kind of calm that settles over you before you even open the door. Drop a comment if you've had a homecoming like that. Not soft, not dramatic, just certain. My mother was already at the table when I arrived, seated in the same chair she'd occupied 7 weeks earlier at Danielle's dinner, and I watched something complicated cross her face. When she saw me walk in, relief, first, unguarded and immediate, quickly smoothed over into something more careful, more controlled, the specific recalibration of a woman who wasn't yet sure what version of this conversation she was about to be handed. "Nora." She stood, started toward me, stopped a foot away, uncertain whether a hug was still hers to offer. I closed the distance myself, because some part of me had decided, somewhere on the drive over, that I wasn't going to make this harder than it needed to be. She held on a beat longer than usual, and I let her. "You look tired," she said, pulling back, studying my face with a specific scrutiny. "Mothers reserved for children, they've been worrying about from a distance." "I've been working a lot," I said. "I actually want to talk to you about that, if that's okay." We sat. Danielle was there, home for the weekend, and my father and my aunt hovering near the kitchen doorway, with the specific watchfulness of someone bracing for a repeat of the last dinner this family had shared. Kyle, no, wrong story. I mean, my cousin Marcus was there too, freshly finished with his law degree, still riding the high of his bar exam results from the week before. I waited until the meal was mostly finished, until the table had settled into its usual comfortable murmur, before I reached into my bag and set the folder down in front of my plate. "I want to show you something," I said to my mother, and the table, sensing the shift, went quiet around us, the way it had 7 weeks earlier, except this time I was the one steering it instead of absorbing it. I walked her through it, the way I would have walked a client through a technical spec, plainly, without embellishment, letting the documents do the talking. The compliance report first, the one that had originally flagged the systemic scheduling flaw across 4 hospital networks. I explained it in terms she could actually hold on to. 41 patients in the first catch, then thousands more once the audit revealed how deep the problem actually ran. Real people who could have shown up for surgery on a day the system had double booked without anyone noticing until it was too late. "This is the deal I found," I said. "This is the thing that started at $14 an hour, part-time, remote, fit around my class schedule." I set the offer letter down, next, salary figure visible, my name typed clean at the top. My mother's eyes moved across it slowly, and I watched her read the number twice, the specific way people read a figure when the first pass doesn't quite match what they were braced for. "They offered me a full engineering role," I said. "Benefits. A development track toward leading their patient safety team once I graduate. Renata," my manager, told me they don't usually make offers like this to someone still in school. They made an exception because the work was good enough that they didn't want someone else to hire me first. Last, I set down the board case study, my name on the byline, the executive team's note attached about presenting it at the investor update. "I'm going to be in the room for that presentation," I said, in front of the board. "Because of code, I wrote in a dorm room on a $14 an hour job. You told me to quit." My mother didn't say anything for a long moment. She picked up the offer letter, held it the way you hold something you're not sure is real, and I watched her hands, steady, careful hands that had packed 2 garbage bags 7 weeks earlier without a second thought, tremble very slightly at the corners of the page. "I didn't know," she said finally, quiet, and I believed her, the way I'd come to believe, over the last week of thinking about all of this, that her original cruelty had never really been about spite. It had been about the limits of what she knew how to see. "I know you didn't," I said. "That was the whole problem, Mom. You didn't ask. You decided." Danielle, sitting across the table, had gone very still, watching the exchange with an expression I couldn't fully read. Something between guilt and awe, the specific look of someone realizing a story she'd absorbed secondhand had been badly incomplete. "Nora, I had no idea," she said quietly. "I thought you had like a coding side gig." Mom made it sound like. "I know what she made it sound like," I said, not unkindly. There wasn't room in me anymore for blaming Danielle for a story she'd only ever been handed, not built herself. "It's okay. You didn't do anything wrong." My aunt, still hovering near the kitchen doorway, exhaled audibly, the sound of someone who'd been holding her breath through an entire scene. She hadn't fully understood the stakes of until just now. My father spoke next, and it was the most words I'd heard him string together in years, without my mother finishing the sentence for him. "I'm proud of you," he said, looking directly at me, no hedging, no glancing sideways to check whether the sentiment was permitted. I should have said that 7 weeks ago. I should have said it a long time before that. "I'm sorry I didn't." "Thank you, Dad," I said, and meant it, even though I understood, the way I'd understood with him 7 weeks earlier. When he'd sent that single midnight text, that his courage had always come in small, late installments, and I'd made my peace with that being the shape it was always going to take. My mother set the offer letter down carefully, squaring its edges against the tablecloth, like precision might steady something else in her at the same time. "I told you to quit," she said, and it wasn't quite an apology yet, more like the first honest accounting of the fact itself, stated plainly instead of defended. "I told you to find somewhere else to sleep, over this." She gestured at the folder, at the offer letter, at the number that had apparently rearranged something in how she was capable of seeing me. "You told me that over a version of me you'd already decided wasn't worth understanding," I said. "The job was never really the problem, Mom. I could show you 100 versions of this folder, and if I bring home a partner someday, or a career, or a life that still doesn't look like the picture you already have framed in your head, we're going to have this same conversation again, just with different numbers in it. I need you to actually hear that part, not just the part where the number turned out to be big enough to impress you. She was quiet for a long moment, and I watched her do something I'd genuinely never watched my mother do before in my entire life. Sit inside a silence without rushing to fill it with a correction, an excuse, a redirection towards someone else's dinner conversation. "You're right," she said finally. "I don't know if I can promise I'll never do it again. I can promise I'm going to try to ask next time, instead of deciding." It wasn't everything. I want to be honest about that. The same way I've tried to be honest through this entire story. A folder full of proof and one difficult dinner don't undo 20 years of a family's arithmetic overnight. But it was true, and it was more than I'd had 7 weeks earlier, standing in a kitchen, looking at 2 garbage bags packed with my whole life. And I'd learned enough by then to know the difference between a total resolution and an honest beginning, and to be grateful, specifically, for the second one instead of demanding the first. Some endings don't arrive as a single dramatic reversal. They arrive as someone finally sitting still long enough to actually listen. If you've ever had to hand someone the proof before they were willing to ask the question themselves, you already know that's its own kind of victory, even when it's quieter than you expected. Drop a comment if this story's ending felt familiar to you. I read every single one. I didn't move back home. That part surprised my mother, I think, more than anything in the folder had. The fact that reconciliation, once it was finally offered, didn't automatically mean I wanted my old room back, my old shape, my old place at a table where my worth had always been conditional. "I like where I am," I told her gently. A few weeks later, once the dust from that dinner had settled into something calmer, Priya and I are looking at renewing the lease together. "I want you in my life, Mom. I don't need you to be the reason I have a place to sleep." She didn't argue with that. I think, by then, some part of her had finally understood that the ultimatum she'd handed me 7 weeks earlier hadn't just cost her a fight about a $14 an hour job. It had cost her the specific, quiet authority she'd always assumed she'd have over my life indefinitely. The assumption that I would always need her enough to shrink myself back into whatever shape kept the door open. I still go to Sunday dinners now, most weeks, when my schedule allows it. My mother asks about work now, real questions, sometimes clumsy ones, sometimes questions that show she still doesn't fully understand what failover logic or cross-campus resource allocation actually means. But she asks, and she listens to the answer, instead of waiting for a translation into something she already recognizes. I started my full-time role at Pulse Point the week after I graduated. Exactly on the track Renata had promised, leading the patient safety engineering team, 8 months later, younger than anyone else who'd held that title before me. I kept the folder, the original one, the physical stack of paper I'd carried into that Sunday dinner. It sits in a drawer in my apartment now, not because I need it as ammunition anymore, but because I think everyone should keep at least one piece of proof, somewhere solid, from the exact moment they stopped waiting for someone else's permission to know their own worth. 7 weeks. That's how long it took to go from 2 garbage bags by the front door to a board presentation with my name on the byline. And longer than that, if I'm honest, to finally understand that the second thing was never really about proving the first thing wrong. It was about learning. For the first time in my whole life, to do my own math and trust the number I got, whether or not anyone else at the table was ready yet to check it. And,